This is the Colosseum in Rome. It's probably among the most instantly recognizable places in the world, like Stonehenge or the Pyramids of Giza. And sure, ancient Roman amphitheaters are fine.
Are you not entertained?
But literally down the street from the Colosseum is a building that I think is way more interesting. It's amazing for all sorts of reasons, but in particular for what it tells us about how and why the past gets buried underground over the centuries. This is the Basilica of San Clemente. It may not look like much from the outside, but this church contains almost the entirety of Roman history, from the ancient city up to the early modern period. Today, a full visit to this church, which is very much worth seeing if you're in Rome, starts out roughly at ground level and then goes deep below the surface. How many layers down?
2 levels. 3. Not possible.
Very possible. You end up far underground, at the street level of ancient Rome. How did this happen? Why do we end up with this sort of layer cake of history? We're about to find out. Grab a shovel and let's take a visit, or at least a virtual visit, to the... San Clemente was built in honor of Pope Clement I, who was pope from 92 to 99 CE, at least per the Vatican. Clement was also martyred. In his case, he was tied to an anchor and then thrown into the sea, which makes staying afloat challenging. He was then made a saint by the Christian Church. The Church of San Clemente doesn't date back all the way to Pope Clement's own day, but by the 4th century, there was a church dedicated to Clement in Rome. And we know this because the early Christian theologian St. Jerome, writing around the year 380, mentions a church in Rome built in Clement's honor. So we've got a very old reference to a church dedicated to Clement in Rome, and we've got a very old church known as San Clemente that still stands in Rome today. End of story, right? Not so fast. For centuries, people did assume that this church and the one mentioned by Jerome and some other early Christian writers were one and the same. But by about 1850, a Dominican priest named Father Joseph Maluli began to have some doubts about this. In his view, the topography of this part of the city, that is, the features of the land around the church, just didn't make sense for this to be a late antique structure. He also looked at some details in the marble furnishings inside, and they didn't seem quite right either. Instead, Father Maluli suspected that the original San Clemente was actually buried somewhere nearby. Over the next several years, workers painstakingly excavated the site of San Clemente. Father Maluli says that some 150,000 cartloads of rubble and gravel were carried out in baskets on the shoulders. When they were done, they found an entire other church directly below the current one. What's even more impressive is that it was remarkably well preserved. It even had its original columns and the remains of extensive wall decorations. Today, you visit this lower church by going down a set of steps just off the right or north side of the upper church. And in case you're wondering, when they were excavating this lower church, they also had to install some brick vaults and arches in order to support the upper church above. So it turned out that this was the early Christian basilica from late antiquity, a church below a church, not just of a similar size, but actually a bit wider than the one on top. At this point, we're a little over 4 meters, or about 14 feet below the level of the pavement of the church above us. And actually, that upper church is already below the modern street level. You have to go down a few steps to enter it. But hold on, now that we know the upper church isn't the one mentioned back in the 380s by Jerome, how do we know if this lower one is that church? What if it's just churches all the way down? Well, Father Maluli and his team kept digging. And it just so happens that there is another level below this church. Today, you take more stairs down to this sub level. At this point, we are at the street level of ancient Rome in the 1st century CE. There are 2 ancient buildings here, neither of which was originally a church. One is a large rectangular building whose outer walls are big blocks of tufa, a type of limestone. We think this building was originally a mint. Its interior walls have some amazing brickwork, and one of the rooms even has an ancient spring of flowing water. Up until recently, you could reach down and touch this water. It's now covered up with a plexiglass plate or something. The other building at this level is an apartment house, or insula. But what's really amazing is the space between these 2 structures. In this photo, we are literally standing in an ancient alleyway, as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. Above us is all the chaos and madness of modern Rome, and down here is a little slice of the ancient city. Just imagine all the crazy hijinks that might have happened in this alley. But this layer has more to reveal. There is evidence down here of previous buildings that were even older and deeper than the Mint and the apartment house. So while we've gone 3 levels down, there is an indication of a 4th level, though it's not really accessible in the same way. But again, there is evidence of it. Okay, so we've made it to the deep past. How do we go from here, way underground, to the medieval church several levels above us and the modern street level? What's the deal with all this layering of history? For that, we need to do the return journey.
Back to the future!
Or at least, we need to go back to the future from the perspective of this level nearly 2 millennia down. So let's consider. We're currently at the lowest level that you can visit and explore today. And as mentioned, there is some evidence that there were structures down here built even before the Mint and the apartment house. It's not clear what exactly was at that original level, but it probably dates back to the time of the Emperor Claudius or Nero, so sometime in the 1st century CE. But in the year 64, there was a major fire in Rome. It burned for several days and caused widespread destruction across the city. And here is how the past gets buried. Before the development of modern construction and earth-moving equipment, it was generally way easier to just build on top of older, ruined structures. When the dust or ashes had settled from the Great Fire in 64, Romans wouldn't have bothered with clearing out all the wreckage. That's a lot of work. Instead, they often just filled in the ruins and began constructing on this new layer of the ground. And it was on this ground, atop the ruins of the Great Fire of Rome, that the Mint and the house were built, sometime around the end of the 1st century or the start of the 2nd century. About 100 years after the house was completed, a religious group decided to add a worship space to the building's central courtyard. This was a small but growing religion that featured sacred meals, a supernatural divine birth, and initiation rites for its members. I'm talking, of course, about Mithraism. This was one of several religious mystery cults that popped up in the ancient Roman world. Christianity was not the only game in town. We can't get too deep into Mithraism, but it was popular among Roman soldiers from the 1st to 4th century. If you're curious to learn more, let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can put together something on the mystery cult of Mithras. Anyway, back to San Clemente. Here's where the timeline of construction gets a little fuzzy, so I'm just going to go with what I think is the likely scenario. Just keep in mind that there's some disagreement among scholars on the exact details and dates. Sometime in the middle of the 3rd century, the upper floors of the Tufa building, the Mint, were demolished and the lowest level was filled in. That would have further raised the ground level. At this point, a private house was built on this new level. The house probably served as a gathering space for Christians. And eventually, sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century, that private worship space was renovated and transformed into a public worship space. It became the lower church of San Clemente. Its form is pretty much the standard early Christian basilica shape. It's got a nave, 2 side aisles, an apse, and originally had a rectangular atrium in front. Again, all built atop the ruins of the previous structures, the Mint and the apartment house. This early Christian basilica was used for hundreds of years. Over the centuries, it was restored and renovated several times, as you'd expect for something so old. The last of these renovations took place in the 11th century and included a number of new frescoes or wall paintings. We won't go into detail on them, but I do want to point something out in one image that I think is really fascinating. This painting, which shows a story from the life of St. Clement, features some of the earliest written Italian that survives anywhere. Maybe not surprisingly, it has someone yelling and cursing. This guy over here has been fooled into thinking his servants are dragging Clement to prison. In reality, they're just pulling a stone column. He's shouting at them in early Italian, "Figli delle pute, traite," which means, "Pull, you sons of bitches," along with a few other lines. And just like in modern comics, the words are next to the speaker. Back to San Clemente itself. Very soon after these renovations and frescoes in the late 11th century, this lower church was replaced with the upper church. It's not exactly clear why. This meant that any openings in the walls of the lower church were filled in, the colonnades were blocked up, and then the lower church was completely filled with rubble and dirt. This became the foundation for the new church, which was built directly on top of the old one from about 1100 to 1120. If you look at the plans of the two churches, you can see just how closely the upper one follows the old. The south aisle wall is built directly on top of the older south aisle wall. The south colonnade is on top of the lower south colonnade. But then they built the north colonnade on a new foundation, and the north wall is on top of the old north colonnade. What this means is that the new church is a bit narrower than the lower one. But in general, its form is the same: a central nave, two side aisles, a semicircular apse, and an atrium with a courtyard. So we're back in the Middle Ages, the future from the point of ancient Rome, where we just were all those layers down. Or are we? See these columns in the upper church? Every single one of them has a shaft that dates back to ancient Rome, and almost all the bases of the columns are ancient as well. The capitals date to the 18th century, but before then it seems that the original ones were also ancient. So we haven't gotten away from ancient Rome after all. This reuse of old columns and building materials is not unique to San Clemente. Lots of medieval churches in Rome and elsewhere reused older materials. And why wouldn't you? The city was filled with building materials. Repurposing them was much easier than doing all the hard work of quarrying new stone, transporting it, and then carving it into the desired shape. But it's more than just reusing old building materials. At San Clemente, the form of the church itself is a throwback to late antiquity and the early days of the Christian church. The same is true for many of the original decorations, like this apse mosaic that calls back to early Christian decorative elements. There are many reasons to make these sorts of formal decisions, but a lot of it probably has to do with highlighting the deep history of Christianity in Rome. We see similar throwback decisions being made in other churches around the city from about the same time. What is unique to San Clemente is just how much of its physical history is preserved and accessible to us today. That's what makes visiting it so amazing. You can very literally walk down into the past, step by step, layer by layer. The reality is that Rome, like many cities, has millennia of material culture buried everywhere beneath its surface. Most of it stays hidden unless someone excavates it. This can be the result of things like the ground level rising due to the erosion of nearby hills, or sediment deposits from flooding, but it's generally due to the nature of ancient construction practices. The rubble of old buildings makes a great foundation for new buildings. And it's much easier to build on top of wreckage than it is to clear it out. So, if you're someone who loathes cleaning up a mess, take heart. You're part of a long tradition of construction history, all the way back to the ancient craftsmen who built not one, but two churches of San Clemente that have stood for centuries. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and leave a comment to let me know. If you've been to San Clemente, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. For more videos about art and history, subscribe to the channel. And if you want a transcript and a link to all my sources and image credits, check out the links in the description.